All right, so as I just mentioned, we're in chapter 10, but I want to go back and read the last verse of chapter 9, because I think this kind of sets the stage for chapter 10. So after all this reading and confessing, and they've come to the conclusion now, because of all this, that's the reading and the confessing, we are making an agreement in writing. And on the sealed documents are the names of our leaders, our Levites, and our priests. Now, chapter 10, now on the sealed document were the names of Nehemiah, the governor, the son of Hakaliah, and Zedekiah. I need a volunteer to read verses 2 through 27. No, I'm just teasing. I wouldn't do that to you. I would do it myself, but I might be able to get Jeremiah, and that might be about it. Maybe the Levites, the word Levites, not the other Levites. So we see that they've come up with this document. So they have this sealed document. And who's the first person's name on this list? Nehemiah, right? And he even kind of, he gives a title, Nehemiah the governor. So we see that his name is on the list. He is the governor. He is their political leader, I guess, kind of like what our governor of the state would be, the head politician of the state. And so we see that his name's on that, the Levites and all the leaders of the people. And so we see that, and it goes down and it lists all these different people. And now I want to skip on down to verse 28. It says, now the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all those who had separated themselves from the peoples of the land to the law of their God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, all those who had knowledge and understanding are joining with their kinsmen, their nobles, and are taking on themselves a curse and an oath to walk in God's law, which was given through Moses, God's servant, and to keep and observe all the commandments of our God, our Lord, and his ordinances and his statutes, and that we will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land or take their daughters for our sons. As for the peoples of the land who bring wares or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath for a holy day. We will forego the crops the seventh year and the exaction of every debt. So here in the very beginning of this, we have the list of people that signed the document. But in the rest of this verse in 28, it talks about everybody that had knowledge and understanding was also agreeing with this document. So it's kind of like these people were signing for them. And it goes on to mention, all the way down to their sons and their daughters. I mean, does that ever happen for us whenever a document is signed for us? Our name is not on it. Whenever they signed the Declaration of Independence or one of those documents, everybody in the country's name wasn't on it, but they were still, part of that. So here we see that everybody is part of this document and all the ones who understood. And I think this kind of shows that they had some unity, right? All these people were unified in this decision. And I think in verse 29, there's 2 points that I want to bring out. The first point is they had an obligation to God's word. And are taking on themselves a curse and an oath. I'll get to the point here. And to keep and observe all God's commandments. So here we see they are putting God's word or God's commandments as the focus of this document. We're going to keep those commandments. Well, that's the second point. The first point is, I think that they verify that God's commandments, are true. And then they're going to say they're going to keep those commandments. They're going to walk in God's law. Now it says they're taking on the blessings and the curses. Have we ever heard that terminology before in history prior to this? When would that have been talked about? I'm sorry? Yeah, in Deuteronomy, right? You remember, I think Moses told them that whenever they got there, they were supposed to put on one mountain, they were going to read the blessings, and the other mountain, the curses, and all the people were going to agree to this. So what they're doing is they're recommitting themselves to God, the same way those people committed themselves to God. And so they accept, and whenever Sid was here, he talked about like some of these covenants being like a suzerainty covenant where they were like, recommitting themselves or making this new covenant. And so I think these people are making this new covenant personally with themselves because their fathers had done what with the covenant? They had broken it, right? That's why they were, taken into captivity. And so we see that they are going to be willing to take on these blessings and these curses. Is that a light commitment? Because the blessings are pretty nice, aren't they? Does anybody not want the blessings? Raise your hand. Does anybody want the curses? No. So I think this is this is a big commitment because the blessings are huge, but the curses are also very, very serious as well. And we see that here in verse 30, they mention the problem that they've had from the very beginning, it seems like. It says, in that we will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land or take their daughters for our sons. This has been a problem they've had throughout. And so we see that they're going to again make a commitment not to do that. And then in verse 31, it talks about the Sabbath. It says, as for the people of the lands who bring wares of any grain or Sabbath on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath day or a holy day. And we will forego the crops the seventh year and I don't know how to say that word, exaction of every debt. So here's this idea that even though the people of Israel were not selling stuff on the Sabbath, what were they doing? Seems like they were buying goods from foreigners, right, who had no commitment to the Sabbath. And so we see that they said that we're not even going to do that, buy from those foreigners. We're going to keep the Sabbath. And what's this idea of the seventh year? Does anybody remember in the covenant what they were not supposed to do on the seventh year? All right, they were supposed to let the land rest and not plant any crops. And if you talk to people that are agriculturists, what's a reason that they might have for that? Because even, in crop management, a lot of times it's best to let a piece of land, they call it lying fallow, so it'll be in better production. But I don't know that that was the reason God gave that command. That may have been part of it. But what do you think the true reason God gave that command not to plant those crops that seventh year? Trust, right? Whenever you don't plant that crop, whenever you plant a crop, you're expecting a harvest, you're expecting food to eat, a way to sell your food, to get other things. As a nation, think about that as the United States. Next year, we're not going to plant any corn. We're not going to plant any beans. The whole country. Y'all have driven across the country. How much corn and beans is out there? There's a lot. And so if we did that, what do you think would be the result? People would be like, there would be no feed for cattle as much. There wouldn't be, bread. They do lots of other things with corn. I guess they make some fuel out of it as well. But we see that would take a pretty big commitment. And so I think God did it so they would trust in him. And it doesn't seem like they've been doing this. And they make the commitment to do it, which I think is a big commitment. All right. And also they talk about this no exaction for debt or no pressure for payments of debt during that Sabbath year. Any thoughts or comments on this part about the Sabbath, making the commitment to do that? I mean, it's a pretty big deal when you sign a contract to make that commitment, I think. Also, let's look at verses. Any thoughts or comments on that before we continue on? All right, let's look at verses 32 and 33. We also place ourselves under obligation to contribute yearly 1/3 of a shekel for the service of the house of our God, for the showbread, the continual grain offering, for the continual burnt offering, the Sabbaths, the new moon, for the appointed times. for the holy things and for the sin offerings, and to make atonement for Israel and all the work of the house of our God. So here they come up and they're going to make this commitment to give this 1/3 of a shekel. I read somewhere where the original commandment was for a half a shekel a year. And so a lot of people didn't know why this was 1/3. One of the commentators said that maybe that during that time they had changed the value of the shekel or the size of the shekel. And so they were going back to what the shekel was when that commandment was made. I don't know what the difference is or if there was one, but they made this commitment to do this. And they also make here in verse 34, I'm sorry, I didn't get to that. It says, likewise, we cast lots for the supply of wood among the priests, the Levites, and the people, so that they might bring it to the house of our God according to our fathers' households at fixed times annually to burn on the altar of the Lord as is written in the law. Why did they need firewood? For the sacrifices, right? Has anybody ever, gone out and cut firewood? It's fairly hard work, right? You got to load it heavy. You know what they didn't have? Has anybody ever gone out and chopped firewood with an axe? I mean, that's very time. I remember one time that when we were kids, my dad always cut firewood. And he wouldn't let us around while he was cutting. He just had us there to load. You had to be 18 to run the saw. And he had some wedges and axe. And me and Jeff decided we were going to chop down a tree in the woods while Dad was sawing firewood. We got in trouble for that, but it took us forever to chop down. The tree wasn't even that big. And we chopped and chopped and chopped. And we finally chopped that tree down, and Dad wasn't very happy because we were only supposed to cut down the trees that had fallen over. But anyway, it was a lot of work. And so you can imagine bringing this wood in, dragging it in with, animals. So it was a lot of work for the priest. And so we see they commit to help the priest in doing this. And this really, from what I understand, wasn't a command that was given by Moses or anybody. This was something new. This is a new commitment that they make. So they're going to go beyond the law and help, the Levites in doing this job. All right, let's read verse 35 here. That they might bring first fruits of our ground and the first fruits of all the fruit of every tree to the house of the Lord annually, and to bring to the house of our God the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle, and the firstborn of our herds and our flocks, as it is written in the law, for the priests who are ministering in the house of our God. We will also bring the first of our dough and our contributions, the fruit of every tree, the new wine, the oil, to the priests of the chamber of the house of our God, and the tithe of our ground to the Levites, for the Levites are they who receive the tithes in rural towns. All right, so here we see that they go ahead and they commit to bringing in the first fruits of the field and the tithes. It also says they're going to bring in the first, under the command, the firstborn from their flocks. So that would be like if you had a ewe lamb, whenever she lambed the first time, it was a male, you were supposed to bring that, and that was supposed to be part of the sacrifice. On top of that, they were supposed to tithe their fields, and they were supposed to bring the first fruits of their crops. Now, do you think that first calf or first lamb would be easy to give up or harder? It'd be harder, right? Do you know that whenever you have that animal, it takes like 2 years just to get it born. And so you've got 2 years of work into that. And so this is a big commitment. This isn't, it's because we don't really, raise animals and that thing. We don't realize how expensive it is to get an animal to breeding age. to the age of when it would have its first offspring. And so this is something that's a huge financial commitment for these Israelites. And then they were going to give a tenth to the priest. And then here in verses 38 and 39, the priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites receive tithes, and the Levites shall bring up the tenth of the tithes of the house of God to the chambers of the storehouse. For the sons of Israel and the sons of Levi shall bring contributions of grain, the new wine, and the oil to the chambers. They are the utensils of sanctuary, the priests who are ministering, the gatekeepers, the singers. Thus, we will not neglect the house of our God. So, as I understand this, and correct me if I'm wrong, the people gave a tenth to the Levites, and the Levites then gave a tenth to be put into the service to the priests, to take care of them and to all that. So, whenever they would do that, the people and the Levites would then transport all this produce, whatever it is, to Jerusalem to be put and stored in the temple. And they had, as we're going to see later, they had special storerooms in the temple where they stored these things. And so this is not a small task, is it? I mean, it might be, I think I read somewhere some of these cities might be 30, 40, 50 miles away. Would you like to load up some grain or some wheat on a cart, take it to Louisville with a horse or an ox, or maybe you pulling it yourself or carrying it? So that would be a very time-consuming and a huge commitment that these people are making. So that kind of concludes chapter 10. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments? Eddie?
I think all of this is a reminder to the people of Israel that everything they have is a gift from God. And so they were to give the first of everything, to give 10% of everything as a gift back to God. It's not really a gift back to God, it's giving to God what God has given to them. And so that's why it was the first hand. That's why it was the tenth of everything. It didn't represent a sacrifice, like you said, but to recognize that everything they had to start with was given to them by God.
Exactly. So that's, yeah. So Eddie makes the point is they're just giving back to God what's already His. And if you even look at the, I think it's in the Proverbs talks about, God says, the cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. Those are His. And so He's given them there for our use. But whenever we give back to Him, we're only giving back what already belonged to Him anyway, right? That would be like if you as a parent gave your child an allowance, let's say, and they go and buy you a gift with that, they're just giving you back what you already gave them anyway, right? And that's the way it is with God. And we have to be gracious and thankful, to give back to God. And the same thing applies to us. We're not required to tithe necessarily today, are we? But what is everything that we have? Our jobs, everything we have came from God anyway. And so, we should be giving back to that, including of our time and our efforts. So here we have, they come up with this, they don't call it a contract. I'm the one that added that word. They call it an agreement in writing that they're going to do. Now, let me ask this question here, just to get you to think a little bit. What's the difference between this agreement in writing and what today certain religious groups would have a creed? Does everybody know what a creed is? So let's just say that we start a new denomination and we're going to call it Kevinism. And I sit down and I write what is true and what is not. And that's the creed of Kevinism. That's a creed, right? And so we see most of if not all of the denominations, they have a creed. We don't have a creed, right? What do we have? We have the Bible. So my question is, what's the difference between this agreement that they've signed and a creed? I think there is. I just want to see if anybody else has any thoughts on that. I think one of the differences is they haven't made any interpretation here, right? They basically said, we're going to keep God's commands. And we're going to do the things that God wants us to do. So they haven't said that if you carry a pack more than 50 feet on the Sabbath, it's a sin. They haven't defined anything but saying God's commandments. So to me, I don't know why I thought of that. That may be way off base, but I think this idea that they have just agreed to do what God wants them to do is what separates that from being a creed. Anybody have thoughts or comments on that? Was that a thought or a question that was off base? Mike?
Two times in the last chapter, they talk about God being God of covenant. He's faithful to his covenant. They totally realize that they fail at it. And they're basically re-entering into the covenant that God already established. And they're willing to put their names on the line to show that there must be that covenant to God. They know that he's faithful.
All right. Dempsey, you had a...
Yeah, just build on the fact that you really put it in writing makes it more compelling. The gravity of it comes out, and you feel more of an obligation to put in your name. They're very serious about it. So very well intentioned, very sincere, you could say, and we'll see if they keep it.
Right. And so, like you see, whenever you sign or put your name on something, I think it means you're taking it serious, and hopefully that's going to make you more accountable to it. Because in the reality, whenever we all sin and we go to God and ask for forgiveness, isn't that something that's very similar to what they're doing here? And whenever we do that, say, I'm not going to do that again, God. I'm going to be faithful to you. I will be your faithful servant. And then what happens to me? I don't know about you all, but some point down the road, I am unfaithful and need to return and once again ask for that repentance. All right. Let's go ahead and look at chapter 11 then real quick. Let's read. I'll read verses 1 through 2. And to me, this is a very interesting, I don't know, just why all this went down. It's kind of hard for me to understand, but we'll read this. It says, now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, but the rest of the people cast lots to bring one out of every 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 tenths remained in other cities. And the people blessed all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. So here we have this situation. They've rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, right? Refurbished it. It's new gates. It's new city. And who lives there? It seems like the leaders live there and the priests, the politicians live there, it's the capital, but there's not anybody else. And I don't really know if I fully understand why. Maybe because what was their society? Their society was an agrarian society, right? It's hard to be a farmer if you live in the city walls. I guess you could walk out to your fields, but that would be, and so they have to come up with, they need some people to come and move to Jerusalem to reestablish the city. And that kind of tells me a couple of things, that when the city walls were tore down, there weren't many people living there. And even after they got it built, a lot of people haven't moved there, and they need some people there, right? Why do you think they need people there? Security, right? So if you have this idea of this walled city, that whenever you're under siege or attack, the people in the other communities could then flee into that city. So you need somebody there to maintain it, maintaining the gates, keeping, people that shouldn't be in out, opening and closing the gates. The people that live there, the priests and the Levites and the officials, they're going to need, somebody to run the bakery, right? Remember we talked about there was the gate by the ovens where maybe they made the bread. Some people doing things like that. So they're going to encourage people, and so they draw lots. So it sounds like the people, it's like, You know, I'll go if I have to, but I don't want to. So we're going to draw lots. And so they draw lots, and 1/10 of the people are going to have to then go and move to Jerusalem. And so in verse 3 here, it talks about how this kind of divides the people up into two groups. I think the people that had to move there, the sons of Judah and the sons of Benjamin. And then, so we have these two groups there, and then we're going to get into this sections here where it's some kind of condensed genealogies of the people, some condensed versions. In verses 15 and 19, it talks about some of the work that they had to do, the Levites and the priests had to do, because they had to go outside the city. Excuse me. So what was some of the jobs here that the priests and the Levites had to do? They had to go out, and they were given the responsibility of teaching the people the law, right? Because they were supposed to understand the law. And so they would have to be, if you're going to teach the people that live the law, they live in all these cities, how do you do that? You have to go to them, right? And teach there so that they can understand. And they probably had to maybe, act as some judges in some certain situations and that type of thing. So we see that they had to work outside the city. And also, that's something I found interesting here. They needed in verse, I think it's 19, they had 172 people to watch the gates. So they had all these gates around the city. I think there were 12 gates, is that right? And so they had to have people there to watch those gates, maybe 2 or 3 people there at a time, watching the gates, opening and closing the gates. Obviously, you can't work 24 hours a day watching the gates, so they had to take shifts. But that seems like a lot of people, doesn't it? That was one of the reasons they needed the people to move back to Jerusalem. And then in verses 23 down through about 26, there's a list of populated towns that are there. There's a lot of names mentioned here in the rest of this chapter that I'm not going to go in and talk about. Talks about the different people that maybe lived in different areas. And all the people were from, the majority of these people were from Judah and Benjamin. That's because if you recall, the northern 10 tribes got carried off into Assyria and never returned. And so most of the people here are from the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. Any thoughts on chapter 11?
And there were 172 names given. The names are given, places where they live. This is something you can verify. You can verify these people, and so it's truly the Holy Spirit giving this information. But the main point I want to make is history with a purpose. History with a purpose. So we have these facts. It's not just I did this, I did that. This is what was done, this is what was said, and this is God's purpose in all of this. And the Bible is the only thing where you have history and purpose, always looking ahead to something else. Something, whether good or bad, it's always looking ahead to a greater purpose. And only the Bible supplies history with purpose.
And one of the things about those names, I skip over those names as if they're not important. And it's not that they're not important, and we can't pronounce them. But if you lived at that time, maybe a couple of 2 or 3 generations later, would those names be important to you? If your dad's name was on that list, if your grandfather's name was on that list, what would that give you? Would that give you a little sense of belonging? It would, wouldn't it? Would that not give you a sense of, not necessarily maybe pride, but that would be important to you. That would be relevant to you. And those genealogies, were they important to the Jews? Why? Because the promise was made to all those descendants of Abraham. So being able to trace your genealogy back to that meant that you were part of that covenant. You were part of that God's chosen people. And so seeing that maybe one of your ancestors, relatively short, was one of these people that was, there reestablishing worship in Jerusalem, that might make you more convicted. If great grandpa was willing to do this, should not. And so I think to us, those names, we can't even pronounce them, but I bet you they could, right? Because those were their family, their relatives. And so to them, I think those lists of names mean a whole lot. Any thoughts or comments on that? So we got 2 more chapters here, and I don't know how this is going to work out with me finishing for next week. I may have 2 verses to do next week, so we'll jump in here to chapter 12, and there's some sections in here with a lot of names too. So if you look at chapter 12 here, now these are the priests and Levites who came up with Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, Sariah, Jeremiah, Ezra. Without reading that list of names, we can go back and we can look at there were about over 4,000 priests who returned to Jerusalem. And this is probably just a list of some of the heads of the families and the main people that came back with them. Another interesting thing was there's between 8 and 11 names that are in this list here that are on the list of names that were on the document that they signed back in chapter 10. So we see that sometimes there's different spellings of these names and some stuff like that. Verses 10 through 11 gives us the genealogies of the high priest from Jeshua. Verses 12 through 21 lists a bunch of priest families. 22 to 26 is the Levites from the time of Joachim. And so that brings us down to verse 27. So let's read that, verses 27 through 30. Now at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out the Levites from all their places to bring them to Jerusalem, so that they might celebrate the dedication with gladness, with hymns, thanksgiving, with songs, to the accompaniment of cymbals, harps, lyres. And the sons of the singers were assembled from the district around Jerusalem and from the villages of the Netophathites, from Beth Gilgal, and from their fields in Gibeah, Mavath. For the singers had built themselves villages around Jerusalem. The priests and the Levites purified themselves. They also purified the people, the gates, and the wall. So here we have, I don't know exactly when this falls in the history. Did this happen immediately after they built the wall? Did they build the wall, read the law, go through all this confession, make this document, reestablish population in Jerusalem, and now they're going to dedicate the wall? I don't know exactly when it was. To me, it seems like because the way I do things is written this way, it has to be here. So it has, but it could, but we see that sometimes the things in the Old Testament are written a little different than that, but not necessarily chronological. And so we see that they're going to have this ceremony to dedicate the wall. And I think that they got to go in and purify themselves, and all the people are going to be there. As we read this is going to be I don't know if I use the word pomp and circumstance kind of event. We've all seen things on TV, like a royal wedding or something like that, where they have lines of people coming in. I'm sure they were dressed in their best clothes. It's probably very well orchestrated. Maybe like the they have the opening ceremonies for the Olympics. I mean, that's usually pretty well scripted, right? And so somebody's gone to a lot of planning and organizing, things that I'm really good at. I'm just teasing about that. So we see that they're going to do that, and they needed to purify themselves and the people. And so here in verse 31 through 43, let's read that. Let's read just through 37, that way it doesn't get too long. Then I had the leaders of Judah come up on top of the wall, and I appointed 2 great choirs, the first proceeding to the right, top of the wall, toward the refuse gate. Hoshea and half the leaders of Judah followed them, with Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shimei, and Jeremiah, and some of the sons of the priests with trumpets, and Zechariah the son of Jonathan, and Shimei the son of Mattaniah, and the son of Micah, the son of Zechor, the son of Asaph. And his kinsmen Shimei, Azrael, Milal, or skip down to those, with the musical instruments of David, the man of God, and Ezra the scribe went before them. At the fountain gate, they went directly up the steps of the city of David by the stairway of the wall above the house of David to the water gate on the east. So here we have this great line of people. And if we read around there, I think this line, as I understand, these 2 lines of people, this is describing one of them, they were long enough that they went halfway around the city. So we're talking about a lot of people that are participating in the ceremonies, right? And so here we see that we have this great pomp and circumstance, and I'm going to call it pageantry. I don't know how else to describe it. And then we're going to read 38 through 43. This is going to describe the second choir. And so the second choir proceeded to the left, while I followed them with half the people on the wall, above the tower of furnaces to the broad wall, and above the gate of Ephraim by the old gate, by the fish gate, the tower of Hanel, and the tower of 100 as far as the sheep gate. And they stopped at the gate guard. Then the 2 choirs took their stand in the house of God. So did I and half of the officials with me, and the priest of, we're going to skip all those names. And on that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced because God had given them great joy. Even the women and the children rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard from afar. So here, as I understand this, we have these 2 great choirs that come and they march in the city, and they all get on top of the wall. And what do you think choirs do? They probably sang, and they had the instruments. It says they had the instruments of David. So they were using instruments that, David used whenever he was there, worshiping God. And so this is a huge thing. And then in the middle of all this, what goes on? In the temple, they're offering these sacrifices. And so I see this being a festival that, it doesn't say specifically here how long it lasted, but I would say it probably lasted for a day. This would be a pretty big deal, right? And so they're dedicating the wall. I also think they're dedicating themselves, right? Because whenever you go to a festival, you don't necessarily go, I guess maybe you dedicate a wall, but you're dedicating it to the service of something, right? And so hopefully they are dedicating themselves to God by being there and being a part of that. All right, and here we have verses 44 through 47. On that day, men were also appointed over the chambers for the stores, the contributions, with the first fruits and the tithes to gather in from the fields of the cities. The portions required by law for the priests and Levites, for Judah rejoiced over the priests and Levites who served. For they performed the worship of their God and the service of purification together with the singers, and the gatekeepers in accordance with the command of David and his son Solomon. For in the days of David, Asaph, in ancient times, there were leaders, singers, songs of praise, hymns of thanksgiving to God. So all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and Nehemiah gave the portions due to the singers, the gatekeepers, as each day required, and set apart the consecrated portion from the Levites, and the Levites set apart the consecrated portion for the sons of Aaron. So here I see that they took this opportunity because they were all coming to Jerusalem to go ahead and bring their tithes, bring a tenth of their crop. And so they bring that and they have people set up to receive that, right? So if you can imagine visually what that might look like. Here you have this long line of people with their, whatever they had, their wheat or their barley or grains or wine in vats, and they're bringing it and they're checking that in. So you got to have people there to carry that into the storehouses. And so they're bringing that to the Levites. They're bringing some up to the singers. And then the Levites are getting a tenth of that and putting it in store in the temple. So you can see this would be, a pretty, kind of big event, because it all seems like it's all happening at one time there. And maybe that kind of leads me to the belief that this dedication ceremony has taken place after they signed this agreement, because they're really committed to it, right? Whenever you first make a commitment on something like that, or first agree to do something, in the beginning, hopefully you're all in, right? It's usually over time when things kind of wane or you get, lax in keeping these commands. We got about 6 minutes there. I'm not going to start chapter 13. So we'll do that next week. I don't think I can make that last the whole time, but we'll come up with something. Maybe y'all just have lots of good comments. Okay.
So one of my favorite things about verse 43 is that the joy of Jerusalem was heard from afar. So these people are offering sacrifices and praising God, and you can hear it far off. It's just an amazing thing.
Yeah, can you imagine being, you hear all the singers singing and the music playing, and they're celebrating and worshiping God. So that would have made an impression on anybody that didn't come anyway, right? All right, very good comment. Thank you. Any other comments? Eddie?
This chapter, I think, shows us the importance of symbols in our worship. I know that people today have often taken that to the extreme where they make symbols just for the purpose of having symbols. And the Bible doesn't encourage that at all. But what we do see there are symbols that are given by God that have significance to us. And that's still true today. For example, the Lord's Supper has great symbolic meaning. And we should not take let the example of others that have made symbols for the purpose of just having symbols make us go to the opposite extreme where we try to avoid all symbolism entirely. We need to recognize there are symbols that are very important. And that's what we see here with the people, the way they reacted, is these symbols were very important to them.
All right. Your comment? Any other thoughts or comments? All right. Well, thanks everybody for your participation.